In the 1830s, settlers moving into the Wisconsin Territory came upon something along the Crawfish River that did not fit anything they expected to find. Rising out of the ground were great flat-topped earthen mounds arranged with clear purpose, and around them ran the remains of a massive wall. To people who had been taught that North America had no ancient cities, this looked like the ruin of a lost civilization, and they reached for the grandest one they could name. They decided it must be connected to the Aztecs of Mexico, whose legends spoke of an original homeland far to the north called Aztlán, and so they called the place Aztalan. The name was wrong. The people who built this town had nothing to do with the Aztecs. But the settlers were right about one thing, which is that they were standing in the ruins of a real and remarkable town, walled, planned, and then deliberately burned and abandoned centuries before they arrived. So Aztalan comes to us wrapped in a mistake, a genuine ancient city buried under a false name. Who actually built a walled town on a Wisconsin river 1,000 years ago, and what happened to them? To answer that, we have to set the myths aside and start with the earth itself, because the physical site is impressive enough that it never needed a legend. Aztalan sits on the west bank of the Crawfish River in Jefferson County in southern Wisconsin, and in its day it was a substantial town covering more than 35 acres. The most striking feature is the wall. The community was enclosed by a massive fortification, a palisade of upright logs, plastered over with a mix of clay and grass in what builders call the wattle and daub technique, and set at intervals along it were projecting bastions, square towers that would have let defenders watch and cover the wall between them. This was not a casual fence. It was serious defensive architecture, the kind you build when you expect trouble, and the town had inner walls as well, dividing and protecting different areas within. Inside and around the enclosure stood the mounds. Aztalan had flat-topped earthen platform mounds, 3 of them prominent, rising in stages like low-stepped pyramids. These were not burial mounds in the usual sense. They were platforms, raised foundations that would have carried important buildings or served ceremonial functions, with ramps and structures on top. Anyone who has seen the great mounds of the Mississippi Valley recognizes them instantly, because that is exactly where they come from. Between the mounds lay an open plaza, the organized public heart of the town, laid out with the same sense of planning you find in the larger Mississippian centers to the south. There is also a deeper layer of earthworks in this landscape, older than the walled town. The region around the Crawfish River was already home to the effigy mound builders, late woodland peoples, who for centuries had raised low mounds shaped like birds, bears, panthers, and long-tailed water spirits across southern Wisconsin. When the Mississippian newcomers arrived and built Aztalan, they were not settling in empty land. They were building among people who had their own ancient and very different tradition of shaping the earth, and near Aztalan, the two worlds sat almost side by side. The reconstruction of much of this we owe to careful 20th century archaeology. When a researcher named Samuel Barrett excavated Aztalan around 1919, he found the post molds, the stains in the soil left by the rotted upright logs of the old stockade, and from them the line of the wall and its bastions could be traced and eventually rebuilt. Today, Aztalan is a state park, with sections of the palisade and the platform mounds reconstructed on the original ground, so a visitor can walk the outline of a 1,000-year-old walled town and stand on top of its mounds above the river. If you enjoy slow documentaries that clear away the myths and show you the real ancient site underneath, take a moment to subscribe, because it genuinely helps these longer videos reach the people who like them. Because the question of who built this and where those mounds and that wall actually came from was answered not by the Aztec guess, but by patient survey, beginning with one of the first scientists ever to study it. That man was Increase Lapham, a self-taught naturalist and surveyor often called the father of Wisconsin science. Lapham investigated Aztalan around 1850, and he did what the excited namers of the site had not. He carefully measured and mapped the earthworks, recorded them in detail, and conducted preliminary excavations, treating Aztalan as evidence to be documented rather than a legend to be embroidered. In 1855, the Smithsonian Institution published his work as the Antiquities of Wisconsin, as surveyed and described, the first published book on the archaeology of the region. Lapham's survey preserved a precise record of the site at a time when settlement and plowing were already damaging it, and it set Aztalan on the path from curiosity to genuine archaeology. That timing mattered more than it might seem. Aztalan had already begun to suffer by the time Lapham reached it. Early settlers had plowed across the mounds, carted off soil, and even dug into the earthworks looking for treasure or curiosities, and some of the original features were being erased year by year. Lapham's careful maps captured details that would otherwise have been lost entirely, which is why his volume is still consulted today. It is one of those cases where a single patient observer, working at the right moment, saved a piece of the past that the surrounding rush of settlement was busy destroying. What that archaeology eventually revealed is more interesting than any Aztec fantasy. Aztalan was a Mississippian town, part of the same cultural world that produced Cahokia, the enormous city that stood near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers in what is now Illinois, some 300 miles to the south. Cahokia, at its height, was the largest city north of Mexico, with tens of thousands of people and more than 100 mounds. And the evidence indicates that many of the people of Aztalan came from that world, carrying its way of building, its platform mounds, its shell-tempered pottery, and its town planning far to the north. The fingerprints of that connection are in the small things as much as the large. The pottery at Aztalan includes the shell-tempered wares typical of the Mississippian South, made with crushed shell mixed into the clay, a technique quite different from the grit-tempered pottery of the local woodland people. The tools, the food remains, the plan of the town, all of it echoes the American bottom, the rich floodplain around Cahokia. Put simply, Aztalan looks like Cahokia's handwriting appearing far to the north. Radiocarbon dating places the occupation of Aztalan roughly between the year 900 and the year 1300, with its main Mississippian phase around the year 1000 to 1200. For a couple of centuries, a piece of the Cahokian world lived here on the Crawfish River, and then it ended, so the real site is genuinely striking. And this is the point where an honest documentary has to slow down and deal with the myths directly, because Aztalan has attracted more than its share of them. Start with the name, because the name is the original error, and it is still on every sign. The link to the Aztecs is completely false. It came from a judge named Nathaniel Hyer, who publicized the site in the 1830s and named it Aztalan after the legendary Aztec homeland of Aztlán, an idea encouraged by the writings of the naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, who had placed that Aztec homeland somewhere to the north. It was a romantic guess built on a coincidence of pyramids and a vague sense that ancient meant exotic. The builders of Aztalan were not Aztecs, were not from Mexico, and had no connection to Tenochtitlan. They were native peoples of the American Midwest, part of the Mississippian world. The name is a monument to a 19th century misunderstanding, nothing more. That misunderstanding was part of a much larger pattern, and it is worth naming, because it is the same pattern that haunted the copper mines of the north and the mounds of the whole eastern woodlands. 19th century America was gripped by the idea that the great earthworks scattered across the continent had to be the work of some vanished superior race, Aztecs, wandering old world peoples, a lost tribe, anyone but the ancestors of the native nations living right beside them. Calling the Wisconsin site Aztalan fit that habit perfectly. It reached past the obvious answer that indigenous Americans had built a sophisticated town in favor of a distant and exotic one. The correction that archaeology later supplied is not just a fact about one site, it is part of returning credit for these achievements to the people who actually earned it. Then there is the darker story, the claim that the people of Aztalan were cannibals. This one also traces to the early excavations, where broken, burned, and butchered human bones were found in refuse areas, and Samuel Barrett conjectured that they were the remains of cannibal feasts. It is a lurid image, and it stuck to the site, but it does not hold up well. Most of the evidence now points instead to mortuary practices, to the processing and treatment of the dead as part of normal funeral customs, which can leave marks on bone that a startled excavator might misread as butchery. The confident cannibalism story is not supported, and careful archaeologists treat it as unproven at best. It is another sensational layer laid over a site that did not need one. That leaves us suspended where this kind of history belongs, with the myths cleared away and a real harder set of questions still standing. Because once you strip off the Aztecs and the cannibal feasts, what remains is a genuine mystery, and it is a better one. The deep question at Aztalan is not who the exotic strangers were. It is why a Mississippian community built a fortified town this far north in the first place, and what happened to it. Aztalan was a frontier, a northern outpost of a southern world planted among the local late woodland peoples who were already living in this part of Wisconsin, and building the effigy mounds the region is known for. The newcomers arrived with a very different way of life, and for a while the two coexisted. Why they came at all is one of the real puzzles. A frontier town 300 miles from home is an enormous undertaking, and people do not build one casually. Some archaeologists think Aztalan was a trading outpost, a way for the Cahokian world to reach the resources of the north, its furs, its copper, its access to the upper Great Lakes. Others see it as a genuine colony, a group of Mississippian people who moved north and recreated their hometown in miniature, mounds, plaza, palisade, and all, as a way of holding on to who they were in a foreign land. The heavy fortification suggests that whatever brought them here, they did not feel entirely safe once they arrived. Then Aztalan was walled ever more heavily, and in the end, it was burned. Whether that fire was an enemy's attack, an accident, or deliberate closing of the town by its own people as they left, the evidence does not clearly say. Sometime around the year 1200, the people gathered up, or gave up, and Aztalan emptied out. And here, the convergence that this format usually leans on is honestly thin, which is itself part of the story. There's no clean, surviving oral tradition that points a finger at Aztalan and says, "We built that, and here is why we left." The Ho-Chunk, or Winnebago, are the historic native nation of this part of Wisconsin, and their deep roots in the region are real. But a direct, demonstrated line from the Mississippian builders of Aztalan to any single later nation has not been established. The people who raised these mounds may have moved away and merged into other communities, may have returned south toward the Cahokian heartland as it too declined, or may have contributed to nations still here in ways we cannot yet trace. The obvious objection is worth answering directly. If native peoples built this, why is the memory of it so unclear? And the honest answer is that a great deal of time, a great deal of movement, and the catastrophic disruption that came with European arrival all stand between us and the builders, and that the loss of that clear memory is not a mystery about the site, so much as a wound in the record. What is not in doubt is that Aztalan matters to native people now, whatever the precise lines of descent. It is one of the most significant ancient sites in the upper Midwest, a place where the reach and ambition of indigenous North America is written plainly into the ground, and it is treated by many as a sacred and important place deserving of respect, rather than as a tourist oddity with a funny name. The uncertainty about exactly which nation descends from the builders does not make the site any less native. It makes it a shared inheritance of a continent whose history ran deep and complicated long before it was written down. None of this diminishes what Aztalan is. It only refuses to pretend we know more than we do. The town was real, the people were ancestral Native Americans of the Mississippian world, and the specifics of their identity and their fate remain genuinely open. That is the honest position, and it is a far more interesting one than a lost Aztec colony. Here is what nobody seriously disputes. Aztalan was a walled Mississippian town of more than 35 acres on the Crawfish River, with platform mounds and a bastioned palisade built by people connected to Cahokia, and occupied roughly between the year 900 and 1300 before it was abandoned. Increase Lapham surveyed it and published his account through the Smithsonian in 1855. The Aztec name is a mistake, and the cannibalism story is unproven. Those are the solid stones. Here is where the questions begin. We do not know exactly why a Mississippian community built and defended a town this far north, or what daily relationship they had with the late woodland peoples already living around them. We do not know what burned Aztalan, or whether its people fled, were driven out, or simply chose to leave, and we do not know, and may never fully know, who among the living nations of North America can call the builders of Aztalan their direct ancestors. Walk the grounds of Aztalan today, and it is a quiet, green place above the Crawfish River. The reconstructed palisade runs its line across the grass. The platform mounds rise in their steps, and interpretive markers try to explain a town that ended 8 centuries ago. In summer, the prairie around the mounds grows tall, and the river slides by low and slow, and school groups climb the largest platform where a temple or a chief's house may once have stood. It is peaceful in a way that hides its history, because for a while this was a walled place on edge, a southern city's northern gamble, watching the tree line for whatever it had built those bastions against. On a still afternoon, with the swallows over the water, it is hard to picture the walls going up, the fires burning, and the town emptying out for the last time. But the mounds are real, the wall was real, and the labor that raised them was real. Whatever name we have, wrongly hung on the people who did the work. Every basket of earth carried up to build those platforms was carried by a real pair of hands 1,000 years ago on this exact bend of the river, and no error of naming can take that away from them. History is rarely settled by a single site or single survey. It is assembled slowly, one careful map, one excavation, one corrected error at a time, and some of it stays out of reach behind too many centuries. Aztalan sits in that space, its false name still on the sign, its real builders still partly unknown, its ending still unexplained. The town was built and burned and left and named wrong. Thank you for walking the old wall with me. If you want more of these, the kind that clear away the legend to find the real ancient place underneath, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what the next one does. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When a people build a walled town on a northern river, live in it for 2 centuries, burn it, and vanish from the clear record, how do we ever give them back their real name?